Let us start. Good morning, bonjour. Welcome to this session that we wanted to put at the center of our reflection. Until a few weeks ago, the discussion on the Transforming Education Summit and the Transforming was taking quite important direction toward the different action tracks, looking at action track for schooling, skills for work and life, teachers, digital transformation, financing. And in all the discussion, we were feeling that we were missing the right perspective or the human right perspective. It doesn't mean that it was not there. It's there in a way. It is in the filigrane of every element of the Transforming Summit, but it was not articulated as we should have it from a perspective of the right to education. And giving our work on the evolving right to education since now a year, we had a conference in December where we put some basis for how we can take the right to education to a new stage or new development, giving all the challenge that we are facing with the COVID and what we have learned regarding the COVID crisis, that in one moment, the continuity of learning is put at threat because people cannot access a computer or do not have access to connectivity. But we also knew before the crisis that people are getting to school but not learning. And the right to education is not only to get kids or to get people into a classroom or into a training session, but also to get them trained with and teach it with qualified teachers, to get them in the right infrastructure. But increasingly, we are also seeing that we depend, and our data is hosted somewhere. It can be hosted in Paris, but it can be hosted in New York or in Ouagadougou. And the question is, are we owning our data when we are learning? And who is owning our data? The privacy and our security. Increasingly, we see the climate impact, and people are having access to school here today, but they have to move because of the tsunami, because of impact on their own houses or household. Increasingly, we understand very well that we learn and we start learning almost when we are already in the making, if you allow me the term. So the right to education does not start when we enter into school, but rather when we are in the making. And what does it mean in terms of the right to education? All this has been in a way in the center of our discussion on the evolving right to education. Of course, there is also an important dimension regarding the adult learning and how we continue learning when we are adult, not only when we are actively working, but also beyond the time of working and being also on the retirement. We know that we will have to continue learning, and the situation of the COVID also showed that people will have to continue learning with learning how to deal with health matters, learning how to deal with technology. So all this in a way is shaping our agenda on the evolving right to education. But there are two other elements that I wanted to use in starting our discussion. The second one is, I think, what we have heard from DSG yesterday regarding the ambition, and that rather than just looking at short-term solution, we have to keep our ambition of transformation. And it's obviously, I think, important for all of us that the transformation starts with respecting the human rights and respecting particularly the right to education in its evolving nature. If the transformation is not taken into account, the human rights we are rather in trouble, and then we don't understand probably the same way transformation. The second aspect that is important, that transformation is not bits and pieces, is not an action track on digital transformation separately from other aspects. It's systemic in its nature, and it's systemic within the right to education dimension, how we are covering all the different aspects, but it's systemic when it comes to the link with the other human rights. and the right to education is linked to broader human rights. And I think that that dimension is also important, and we had this discussion as well. Maybe the last element that I thought would be important for us to put in our discussion today, and in a way to see how we will cover it while engaging in the debate, and I hope that the conversation will help us to take it forward. Is that we will need to decide on who are the right bearer when we are speaking about the evolving right to education, and obviously some of us have an important stance on it. This year for UNESCO is the year of lifelong learning. It's not only the year of transformation, and sometimes we are struggling even with the narrative. We had, and we met with Delphine, for example, in Barcelona. We spoke about the right to higher education. We are meeting today and we are speaking about the right to education, broadly speaking. In November, we'll be meeting and we'll be discussing the right to early child education. We met 2 weeks ago in Marrakesh when we spoke about the right to lifelong learning or adult learning. So that lifelong learning perspective is very important. And thinking the right to education, the evolving right to education within a lifelong perspective is from the work we are doing is fundamental. So I would like us to also take into account that it's not only about the discussion on transforming education and the action tracks, which is very important, but also how we take the lifelong learning perspective, and all these conferences that we are having, with the declaration that we are adopting, with the roadmaps that we are having, which are committing member states. They are not committing the Secretariat of UNESCO or they are committing member states. And those are declarations and statements that are putting education and the right to education in the lifelong learning perspective. So I just wanted to highlight those points. But as I mentioned, a few weeks ago, we met with Delphine in Barcelona, and we were discussing the right to higher education. And of course, again, this was some element of debate. What does it mean, right to higher education? And where do we start when we are speaking to the right to higher education? But Delphine probably will take us a bit further on the perspective how what are the needs to expand those aims of education to respond to those new and emerging challenges that I just mentioned. Maybe there are other challenges that I didn't mention. Maybe Delphine, you would like to share with us your perspective. Please, Delphine, and maybe you can introduce yourself as well.
Thanks, Borain. Is it working? Yeah. So I'm Delphine Dorsey. I'm the director of the Right to Education, and as Borain mentioned, I'm just going to give some overview on the aim of education and about like should we expand the aim of education. And first things I would like to highlight is there are already a solid basis in international legal framework on the aim of education, and I think any expansion of the right to education should be built on what is already existing. So in the UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education, but also in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and of course the Convention on the Rights of the Child, there are already a very strong basis for the aim of education, which aim at developing the full personality of a human being, but also working together to build peace, a better society. Even the Convention of the Right of the Child look at the protection on the environment. So I think like in this change of climate change, we should build on that. But it's true, like even there's this solid basis, we see some change in the society and in education. And so there are some discussion about should we expand a bit the scope of the aim of education, or at least to strengthen what is already there. These have been highlighted by the International Commission on the Future of Education. There are currently a revision of the UNESCO recommendation 1974 on human rights education that is rethinking this reflection on the aim of education. And it's on this basis, I just would like to highlight a few points for our own reflection on how maybe we could expand the aim of education. So one point is in the current education context where we see a strong private and business interest in education, which is really a transformation of education over the years, how we can strongly reaffirm the humanistic vision of education and putting the best interest of the child at the center. So this is one point. Brian mentions climate change. I mean, how we can ignore that at the moment. I mean, it's an alarming issue. And so, as I mentioned, the Convention of the Right of the Child have a focus on the protection of environment and nature, but we can probably strengthen that with climate education and making sure how we learn and have a better understanding on the relationship between human being and Earth. Which cover, of course, the content of education, but also how we develop the organization of school in terms of education. We know they are remaining challenging, including violence, for instance, sexual violence, hate speech, and how the aim of education can really help by building respectful relationship, and how maybe we can not only acquire knowledge, but soft skill as solidarity, empathy, compassion, and this is so needed in our society. And we know now with all this work increasing. And maybe a last point before closing on this. We know like the aim of education is also to build inclusive society. We were talking about peace and how this can be done without a truly inclusive education. So already education, the right to education is based on non-discrimination and equality, but how we make sure like the whole education system and how we see education contribute to inclusive education and society. So this is few points. Of course, it does not cover all the aim of education, but it's just to help us to start reflecting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Delphine. Let me pick up the first and the last one, the humanistic and the inclusive and equity. And increasingly, we have been, and we are impacted by the technology. Technology is penetrating all part of our life. And I think the question for us is, how we manage this tension between technology and a humanistic perspective, between technology and equity and inclusion. And for that, we have the pleasure and the honor to have with us Dr. Kumbu Boli Bari, who is UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education. And Dr. Boli has dedicated the recent report to this topic, to the technology in education and how we create learning opportunities, but without taking risks. How we manage this tension between leveraging the technology, but also preventing that it interferes in our privacy, in our security, but it also probably can become an equalizer rather than an equalizer of the of education. Please, Dr. Boli, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bohem. It's a pleasure to meet you and the team, Delphine, Antonis, my colleague, special reporters, and thank you again to Rola and everyone. It's really a pleasure to contribute, and I'm very grateful to the organizer for setting up this important meeting, which stress the needs to adopt an approach based on the right to education at transforming education meeting. There are many international legal provisions dealing with the right to education, all of which were adopted decade ago. But when, as Delphine has already mentioned, but it's good also to know where we are. We have this legal frame, we adopt, the countries adopt, but nowadays, where we are, we know that there are many challenges. As Boren says, we have millions and millions of people who are illiterate, youth, refugees, migrants, girls, women. This is also the situation of the right to education. And we can see really the deep inequalities in the world. And this is what I have, is true, done in my recent report, focus on the impact of digitalization, of right to education. And I mentioned in this report, the legal instrument relevant to the right to education remain fully applicable to digital education. As a special rapporteur on the right to education, I'm one of the UN mechanisms contributing to the development on such interpretation. And I'm also the head of education in at ISESCO. That means I have really many hats to deal with these things. This does not mean, however, that there is no need to develop or expand the international legal framework in a way that makes it clearly for states or other stakeholders. It is also a way of strengthening states' obligations, taking into consideration today's challenges and bringing clarification in that respect. In my real of digital education, I would mention at least 3 issues which I believe would need to be addressed. This could be done whether in the form of a new treaty, a new general comments by the relevant treaty bodies, or any other instrument that would deem to be useful. There is a need for an in-depth and participatory discussion on this. That means the first issue is that of digital education. We need really to have a holistic vision. Holistic vision, that means really important to think from early childhood to higher education. But also it's very important to talk about non-formal education, formal education, but also informal education. And today, also the media learning, when we already see this informal education is growing. In today's increasingly digital world, what comes from a right to education perspective is not so much the introduction of machines and programs to deliver education, but the pursuit of comprehensive digital education to empower people with the digital competencies to actively and freely participate in all dimensions of human life, civil, cultural, economic, political, and social, and to become active citizens. It's very important also to talk about the protection of data. And I really listen from you, and many studies has shown that in all the countries, only Morocco has really allowed to respect how to protect the data of learners and kids. And this is very important to be highlighted and to be sure that each country and the legal frame has really to take into account this challenge. The second issue is that also of connectivity. As proposed by UNESCO Commission, as already raised by Delphine, or the future of education, we should reflect on the need to broaden really the understanding of the right to education to include digital competencies and access as a means of supporting the right to education, the right to information, and cultural rights, and also the other rights. The third one is that full respect shall be ensured for the cultural dimension of the right to education, which means that digital education should be deployed with full respect for people's cultural rights in accordance with the aspiration, needs, resources, and capabilities. That means when we are talking about transforming, we really need to take the new challenges. Also, where the digitalization of education is really highlighting in our humanity, and we need really to talk perhaps not only the right to education and the challenges, the legal frame for early childhood, for basic education, for higher education, or for data protection, or other issues. But we really need to have rights for human rights. I think this is my conclusion. If you want to build a solid civilization and for our humanity. Thank you again. And I wish you really a good meeting.
Merci. Thank you very much. And I think maybe those points about placing education within a lifelong learning perspective take into account also what are the treaties and what are the regulatory framework that have to evolve are important. Maybe the last point is about the exposure to technology and taking the dimension of how we can protect learners, including children online is an important aspect. But probably children have more than challenges than just the technology. Children are having challenges to access to education. SDG 4 has set preschooling as a right and as an indicator that we have to follow, the SDG 4.2. But in realities, we are much far from achieving those objectives. And I think, Mercedes, you are very well placed to tell us a bit how we can ensure those legal guarantee for pre-primary education, and what is the perspective that OMAP has in this context. Please, 3 minutes, if possible.
Thank you. I will try. Well, yes, we have to acknowledge the progress made around the human rights and the legal framework, of course. But connected with early childhood, it is necessary to strengthen them in order to build a solid vision about the citizenship since birth, and about early childhood education and care, and the legal structures to deal to the deep inequalities, exclusions, and injustices that are in this field. And as the time is really short, I will point some issues that are in relation between the incomprehensiveness between the human rights. And I want to address two human rights that are present in Target 4.2. That is early childhood development and early childhood education. Although it is clear that human rights are interrelated and interdependent, it is necessary to note that the right to education during early childhood is closely linked to young children's right to maximum development. Development is, in general, is a general principle of the human rights stated in Article 6 of the UNCRC, and it can only be understood in a holistic manner, together with other rights as health, nutrition, social security, adequate standard of living, healthy and safe environments, education, culture, and play. For this reason, it is important to recognize that high-quality early childhood education and care must encompass all aspects of development. The consideration of the right to development spans the concept of education that cannot be identified with schooling, and defines education as a social and political practice for the enrichment and the mobilization of a holistic development process. Education is a right and a tool for the realization of other rights and embraces a broad range of life experiences and learning practices which enable children to develop their personality, talent, abilities, to live a full life and a happy life, satisfying life, of course, within society. Development is not just a matter of maturation, and it is strongly determined by the interactions of each child with his or her culture. So we need to advance about the right to culture. The right to culture is very important in early childhood, and that means children access, participation, and contributions to culture. The right to culture is intimately related to quality early childhood education provision. Also, development is, we have to consider that is facilitated by other persons. Adults are needed, but it is necessary to emphasize that every child has the right to participate in social life, especially with other children. Children together create forms of play that are rarely achieved in adult-child relations. Children need to engage with peers and of both sexes, as well as people with different abilities, different genders, classes, cultures, ages, in order to learn about life, about cooperation, tolerance, sharing, and all the citizenship. Play is the key. The right to play is the other right that we have to put in the center of this new legal framework. So this is in 3 minutes, my proposal.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. And I think this multidimensional aspect is a critical one. And we tend to reduce the education to very specific and narrow understanding of skills or specific knowledge. But I think Delphine already broadened a bit this expansive perspective on the education. Maybe just for a transition to the next speaker, just to say, in the last few weeks, I met with 2 ministers, and it's terrible. When we were looking at the data, in those 2 countries, without naming them, the dropout rate at secondary level is around 43%. It's kind of a very dramatic situation where we are speaking about the right to early learning. Of course, we speak about the right to primary education. This remains a challenge. But we see when countries are making progress in access to primary education, some of the challenges and the issues come into the upper secondary, sometimes lower secondary, upper secondary, with a quite dramatic rates of dropout. This is without counting that people are getting into a classroom without necessarily learning at the end. So we have this double, I would say, punishment. One is accessing without learning, and the second one is accessing and dropping from education. And I would like to hear from you, if you don't mind, Mr. Bide Shepard, Deputy Director in the Children's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. Maybe you can share with us a bit the perspective and how you are watching this. We are watching it with very, very, I would say, dramatic perspective on it. And I would like to hear your perspective. Over to you, please.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to presume that if you're here at the Transforming Education Summit, you are already aware of the huge benefits that secondary education can bring to children's lives. And I'm also going to presume that you also already know that far too many children are being unable to access secondary education because of the barrier that is presented by costs. So with my limited time here this morning, I want to focus on what Human Rights Watch sees as a huge problem of internal inconsistency within the human rights framework that is created by the fact that international law does not guarantee all children a right to free secondary education. What do I mean by that? For example, as long as free secondary education is not guaranteed as a right, there will be children who either start to work to fund their own education or who drop out of work merely to work. And that is inconsistent with the commitment provided under international law that children will be protected from work likely to interfere with their education. Another example, designing an education system that establishes a parent's ability or willingness to pay fees as a threshold barrier for whether or not a child can access secondary education is impossible to reconcile with the overarching principle of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, that in all actions concerning a child, the best interests of the child shall be a primary consideration, because it prioritizes the parent's economic ability or situation before any consideration of the child's best interest or their rights. Making secondary education dependent upon parents' ability to pay also runs contrary to the recognition of the evolving capacities of children in the exercise of their rights. As children mature, they're entitled under international law to more decision-making autonomy on whether and how to continue their own education. Yet their agency to exercise their right to education perversely becomes more constrained by their parents' willingness or ability to pay the fees. Sadly, in a world where far too many parents still face social pressure to prioritize their boys over girls when it comes to spending limited financial resources, government imposition of fees can become a discriminatory barrier based on gender, which again is contrary to international law. Gender parity in low-income countries just before the pandemic was 10 points lower for secondary education than primary school. Now, international law currently evades making free secondary education a right by saying things like states can make it progressively more accessible, for example, by providing financial assistance in case of need. But this, again, is inconsistent with a rights-based approach. Part of the argument for having enforceable socioeconomic rights is that poverty erodes a child's dignity and their sense of worth. To say that people may only access free education if they show that they are financially poor is out of sync with the rationale for having a justiciable system of socioeconomic rights. Financial assistance in case of need requires children to flaunt their own poverty, the very thing that socioeconomic rights are meant to protect them against. And anyway, target assistance has been shown to be fairly ineffective as well. So I could go on with the inconsistencies, but because of time, I won't. But to conclude, if the ability to pay constitutes the fundamental criteria in selecting who can access secondary education and all those benefits that we know that come with it, then it's not a decision based on the moral worth of a child. And that's inconsistent with the human rights framework. And so that's why Human Rights Watch is asking delegations to use their presentations at the Transforming Education Summit in September to call for an update to international law that addresses all of these inconsistencies that we're discussing today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Let me take forward the inconsistency, because it follows the learning pathway in reality. Once you have inconsistency in secondary, but you do continue having the inconsistency when you go to higher education. And as I said a few weeks ago, we gathered in Barcelona to celebrate higher education, to celebrate reimagination of higher education or reinventing higher education. But we know also that we still have challenges in terms of the right to higher education, and that the problems you are facing in secondary, probably you will take them forward when you move to higher education, with a much more challenging fees and much more challenging commercial approach toward higher education. But I think, Anna-Raquel, you'll be able to share with us a bit your perspective on how we look at the right to education in higher education for lifelong learning perspective, based also on all the work you are doing in Latin America and the Caribbean. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And as we have established in this meeting, education is a human right throughout life. And as such, youth and adult education and higher education are obligations of states as are early childhood education, primary and secondary education. But I want to make note that youth and adult education is aimed at those who had their right to education violated at some point in their lives. So this ethical imperative of leaving no one behind should be highly prioritized for this group. So states must ensure that education is available and accessible to them at the most convenient time of their lives. Similarly, in this age of digitalization, information, and globalization, higher education is fundamental driver for creating a new development models that guarantee good living and social justice. So therefore, all people who want to pursue studies, who want to continue their careers that either in sciences, innovation, the humanities, and contribute to human dignity should be able to do so without at any time of their life and without any barriers. So we need to talk about how young adult education and higher education improve the living conditions of the subjects of rights and their families' conditions as well. So it creates a generous cycle for more equal society. So states must ensure that these modalities and phases of education are available across territories and without any barriers, including economic ones. And in this point, I want to reiterate our concern with the incursion of private actors and commercial actors in education, because we know this can increase inequalities and segregation in education systems. And here the states have a fundamental role in regulating the private supply and also in avoiding student debt. So the gratuity of education, higher education and youth and adult education is more urgent than ever to overcome these inequalities. And it must also cannot adopt any exclusionary processes of admission because we know these tend to exclude historically marginalized groups. So the content of lifelong learning and education must be acceptable and adaptable to the context of the students. And when I speak about acceptable, it means being free of discrimination and violence, and also free of this hegemonic and standardized thinking that maintains the status quo. It also means being diverse, anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, and decolonizing, valuing the vision, cosmovision, knowledge of other communities. And when I speak about adaptable, it means that it has to be flexible in recognizing the context of students, even in emergencies. So to accomplish these dimensions, the states must guarantee adequate financing to public education and the participation of subjects of rights and their education communities in the debate and policy decision-making. So we need to remember that when states fail to do so, they are tampering with the realization of the human right to education. So to finalize, from a lifelong learning perspective, higher education and youth and adult education must be universal, public, and social goods, a collective bet that society makes to generate social and environmental justice. And as Mercedes mentioned, education is an enabling right for achieving other rights. So I want to close this brief intervention by emphasizing that every person has the human right to access a free, emancipatory, lifelong education. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Enrique. That's very, until now we have been first recalling and giving a more expansive understanding of the education aims and the right to education. We spoke about rights from early learning to adult and lifelong learning. We spoke about the inconsistencies within the legal frameworks and the regulatory framework that we have. We spoke about the importance of the technology, how it is penetrating. The next two intervention will focus more on the enabling environment and the policy dimension that you just mentioned, but also the governance of it and how we can work together. Who are the stakeholders? How they will have to collaborate? what structures have to be in place? You spoke about regulatory frameworks. Who will establish them, and how we can lead them? And for that, we would like to hear from you, Werner. What is your perspective on how this collaborative framework can work? Who are the stakeholders that have to be involved? And what are the responsibilities in this context? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. This is Werner Munoz. I'm working for the Global Campaign for Education. The question is absolutely crucial, so I will address specifically the case of the non-state actors working on education as part of the, of the current environment. So the Global Campaign for Education believes that critical visions are essential to build a transforming understanding of reality and to overcome the conditions of social exclusion and colonization of thought. So we cannot just stay quiet on the increasing privatization of education. So in 3 minutes, if I may, I would like to quickly address 3 key issues. The first, how we see the privatization processes. Secondly, how non-state actors' regulation is critical to avoid the impoverishment of education quality and the impoverishment of families as well, especially but not only in low-income countries. And finally, I would like to quickly mention the context where privatization of education grows. So firstly, let me say that not all private actors are guided by the search of economic gains. And in many cases, different non-state actors are subject to different domestic regulations, depending on the purpose of their activity. So as you know, there is a wide range of non-state actors working on education. We have the not-for-profit schools, usually run by NGOs. We have the public funded private schools, which is the case of Belgium and Netherlands, for instance, which are huge. And we have the faith-based organizations, we have the community-led initiatives, and of course, we have the commercial for-profit establishments and chains. So what is relevant is that in any case, the private initiative should subrogate the state obligation as stated by the international human rights law to progressively secure a free, inclusive, well-funded quality public education and lifelong learning at all levels and modalities. Now, please note that privatization of education is a global trend. It is a global phenomenon, which although it has affected low-income countries, has spread more strongly in the developed ones. So in addition of the increasing school privatization, we also see that public spaces have been co-opted by corporate entities and other private actors. And this happens at national and international levels, where the corporate sectors continues to increase their influence in the public policy decision-making, including the UN, oftentimes without achieving their main obligation, which is paying fair taxes in the countries they profit. The increasing privatization of education is a dramatic obstacle for the Sustainable Development Agenda and for all action tracks, meaning that a better intersectoral approach on the issue is also needed since the commercial takeover is happening in other sectors such as health, labor, environment, and other sectors. Regarding the domestic regulations of non-state actors working in education, the Global Campaign for Education has called for years for supervision, and it is true that many countries have put in place regulatory frameworks of private education. However, these frameworks are more political than legal, And many times the lack of staff makes almost impossible to supervise what is going on the private institutions. While we all know that private initiatives play a role and should be guaranteed as a fundamental freedom, by no means states should transfer their obligation to provide quality education. There is no legal provision in the international human rights law calling governments to allocate public funding for private business on education. And on the contrary, there are plenty research and documentary on the negative impact of privatization, such as the concluding observation of treaty bodies and the reports of the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education. I'm talking about Madame Bolibari, but also Kishore Singh. And I also had the chance to address during my mandate as a Special Rapporteur. So the extension of the right to education should develop further the negative consequences of this specific kind of public-private relations. I'm not sure if there are partnership, but relations. And finally, I just want to mention that the commercialization of education and the role of non-state actors in the education business is not unrelated to the exacerbation of consumer societies and corporations taking over policy decision structures. The privatization and commercialization of education shows the greater disturbance produced by abusive market societies. So again, it is important to produce further contextual analysis in order to get a good understanding of the interrelationships of the right to education with other human rights, which the market-oriented society avoids, making education look like a consumer good rather than an enabling human right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Werner. And I think a few pointers from very rich intervention. The first one is the importance of taking the private sector in a more or say broader perspective rather than limiting it to one specific actor within the private sector and taking non-state actors in a quite broad perspective. Also, the importance of the state obligation and confirming the state obligation. And the third is what are the regulatory framework that have to be in place in this context. But probably there is one tension that and the elephant in the room is that the right to education is not for free. It's even maybe expensive. But then where to find the money to fund the right to education? And maybe this is the most difficult question that we have to put, and it's for you. Maria, we had the pleasure to exchange, and you are looking and leading the Tax Aid Alliance, and your coordinator. And we would like to have some insight on how we solve this equation. I'm engineer by study, by profession, and we need an equation that works. So what is the equation in this case? What are the parameters that we have to put in place? Please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Boren. And thank you very much, everyone, because you have really paved the path. And in order to guarantee and to expand the legal framework, we really need adequate financing. So in 3 minutes, I'm going to try to give you a brief overview of the financing education from a human rights perspective. And basically, some of the key messages is that the states have an obligation, as we all know, to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to education, but not all states have the same amount or quality of resources at their disposal, but progressive realization cannot be used as an excuse for lack of action or progress, right? States, as we know, are obliged to take steps towards the full realization of the right to education, from early childhood to secondary, as well as to higher education, right? And for that, they must use their maximum available resources. what do they mean? What do we mean by that, right? These resources are not only economic resources, but they are also legal, administrative, technical, educational, and among others, obviously. And equally, the obligation to allocate the maximum available resources go beyond the resources currently held by the governments, right? And they include those that could potentially be mobilized, both by the state itself, such as like tackling tax evasion, which is illegal, and avoidance, which is legal, but using loopholes, right? But also international cooperation and development, which includes extraterritorial obligations of countries, such as, for instance, rich countries enabling or profiting from tax abuse. And we have all heard of Luxembourg, right? And other countries like Switzerland, etc. So mobilizing these resources must be done compliant with human rights, which is why increasing tax revenue through progressive taxation is a good way to increase not only revenue, but also to redistribute wealth, to reduce inequality, and to fund education in a fair and sustainable way. This means increasing the 4 S's, okay, of the budget. The first one is the size of the government budget overall, and this is determined by tax, debt, macroeconomic policies, trade, etc. And this is really where we are putting more emphasis as part of the Tax and Education Alliance. Then we also need to increase the share of the national budget dedicated to education, but this shouldn't be done competing with other public services and other rights such as health, right? We need to be working together on this, because what we really need to increase is the size and think outside the budget box. We also need to increase the sensitivity of the budget allocation, and this should be driven by equity and efficiency, but ensuring that there is gender and inclusive responsive budgets. And of course, we also need to increase the scrutiny of the budget, particularly of the education spending in practice, so resources are allocated, dispersed, and spent in a transparent way, enabling participation of stakeholders to increase accountability. So you might not know this, but the estimated figure of tax revenue lost each year to tax havens is 427 billion with a B, okay? Billion. And an extra 245 billion, again with a B, okay, are lost to corporate tax abuse by multinational corporations. So you are thinking where the financing gap for the SDGs could be found? That could be a really good answer. But so basically, it seems clear that the states are not doing enough to control illicit financial flows, and consequently, the states are not using their maximum available resources. As a result, families are paying more and more in direct and indirect school-related costs. As Beth was mentioning, many people are excluded, and we know which groups they tend to be excluded, right? Which is highly regressive and discriminatory way of financing education. And another solution is being posed by privatization. And I always say privatization is not a solution. It's a symptom that things are not being done properly in the public education. So the question, and I'm finishing here, should the legal framework be expanded to strengthen the national and extraterritorial obligation of states to increase the available resources through progressive and global and progressive tax reform, putting an end to tax evasion and avoidance? Do we need perhaps a general comment to clarify how public funds should be raised and used to ensure sustainable and adequate financing of public education, addressing issues such as financing lifelong learning, debt repayment services, austerity policies, or privatization? So I leave it with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And in my culture, usually we have 5 things, usually 5 pillars. So I would like to take the 4 and add to them another S. I think you mentioned the size, the share, the scrutiny, and the sensitivity as well. But you finish it with another S, is the system. Is the system of instrument that we are having that will have to evolve. And probably this is what we can take together is we have a system that probably served its purpose at one point of time. It didn't achieve all its objective, but it made progress, and we have to recognize the progress that we have achieved, right education, but we didn't achieve all, and the landscape is evolving. And this will require from us this evolving perspective on the right to education, from taking it from basic education or schooling to from early learning to lifelong learning, but also take into account the governance and the enabling environment that has to be put in place, and the resources that have to be put in place if we are serious about making the right to education within lifelong learning perspective successful and achievable within the time frame that we would like to have, which is 2030. That's very challenging, but that's what we are discussing in the Transforming Summit. And I hope that our discussion today can feed into the different action tracks, can feed into the different plenaries, and take this lens of human rights in all the elements of our debates during the plenaries, during the side event. Thank you very much. We are, unfortunately, we have to move to the plenary. Thanks to all the panelists, to all colleagues who have contributed with their perspective. It was very rich. And thanks to the team, to Rora, Elise, and Charlene, and also to colleagues there. And have a nice day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.